You were probably taught that history is shaped by great leaders, heroic moments, and bold decisions made in public. Kings, presidents, generals, names, dates, victories. But have you ever had the feeling that something was missing, that the real story felt incomplete? Because behind almost every empire, every war, every economic collapse, there were families you were never taught to question. Families whose power didn't come from elections or speeches, but from bloodlines, money, and secrets passed down for generations. And once you start looking closer, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. What if the most powerful families in history didn't just build nations, but also buried truths? What if the world we live in today was shaped less by ideals and more by deals made in the shadows? And if that's true, what else was never meant for you to know? The history most of us learn is clean, polished, and carefully edited. It focuses on outcomes, not methods, on victories, not the cost. The uncomfortable details, corruption, betrayal, manipulation, and crimes are often softened, ignored, or completely erased, not because they don't matter, but because they threaten the image of those who benefited the most. And this isn't an accident. History has always been written by those with the power to decide what gets remembered and what gets buried. For centuries, real power didn't sit in parliaments or public squares. It lived inside dynasties, families that controlled money, land, armies, and influence, often all at once. While kings came and went, these families remained. While borders changed, their wealth didn't. And while nations fought wars, these families often funded both sides. Power like that doesn't just disappear, it compounds. And when power becomes hereditary, so do its secrets. One of the most common paths to dominance was financial control. Families that mastered banking and lending quickly found themselves indispensable to rulers. Kings needed money to fight wars, expand territories, and maintain control. In return, these families gained protection, political favors, and silence. A dangerous silence. Publicly, they were respected benefactors of progress. Privately, they pulled strings that decided the fate of nations. When scandals emerged, sudden deaths, rigged successions, economic collapses, blame rarely reached them. It was redirected, diluted, or forgotten. Take the first of these powerful families. Their rise was often portrayed as brilliant, strategic, even admirable. Starting with modest influence, they positioned themselves close to authority. They financed rulers, married into nobility, and built networks that spanned borders. To the public, they were pillars of stability. But behind closed doors, the story looked very different. Hidden records point to systematic corruption, bribery disguised as support, rivals eliminated through financial ruin rather than open conflict, political decisions quietly bought, not debated. And when accusations surfaced, they were dismissed as rumors because the family's influence had already reached the institutions meant to investigate them. The result? Immense wealth, untouchable status, and a legacy carefully scrubbed of wrongdoing. The next family took this formula even further. Their wealth was almost unimaginable for the time. Entire economies bent around their interests. Governments depended on them not just for money, but for survival. Wars were prolonged or shortened based on their calculations. Markets rose and collapsed at their signal. And with that level of control came a new level of abuse. Documents and testimonies suggest deliberate manipulation of crises for profit. Food shortages that could have been eased but weren't. Conflicts fueled because peace was less profitable than war. Entire populations suffered while fortunes quietly multiplied. Yet history books rarely frame these outcomes as intentional. They're labeled as complex circumstances or unfortunate consequences. The family's name remains associated with innovation and progress, not the suffering that made it possible. By the time this dynasty reached its peak, consequences no longer applied to them. Laws were flexible, investigations stalled, and critics had a habit of disappearing, socially, financially, or worse. But perhaps the most unsettling story comes from a family whose influence hasn't faded with time. Unlike the others, their power didn't end with monarchies or empires. It adapted. Their institutions still exist today. Their investments still shape industries. Their decisions still ripple through politics, media, and finance. And while their name might not always be visible, their fingerprints are. Choices they made generations ago about borders, debts, and alliances continue to affect modern societies. Economic instability, political dependence, systems designed to benefit a few while millions struggle to understand why the rules never seem to work in their favor. This is where the past stops feeling distant. When you compare these families, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. They all mastered concentration of power. They all avoided accountability. They all controlled narratives. And most importantly, they ensured their darkest actions were never taught as central parts of history. Instead, they became footnotes or myths or were left out entirely. These weren't isolated incidents or bad apples. They were symptoms of a system that rewarded secrecy and punished transparency. A system where the public story was carefully crafted, while the real decisions happened far from public view. So the question isn't whether these families shaped history. The real question is, who decides which parts of that history you're allowed to see? Because once you understand that history is curated, not neutral, everything changes. Heroes become complicated, villains disappear, and power stops looking accidental. What you were taught wasn't exactly false, it was incomplete. And the most dangerous lies are the ones that hide inside partial truths. Even now, there are stories still locked away in private archives. Agreements never meant to be public, actions justified as necessary for stability, and families whose influence survives because their past remains unexamined. So the next time you read about an empire, a financial miracle, or a sudden collapse, ask yourself this: who benefited? Who stayed protected? And what wasn't written down? Because history doesn't just tell us where we came from, it tells us who has been controlling the story all along. And once you start asking those questions, it becomes very hard to stop.